Welcome to the third and final B2B podcasting session that I'm having here with Chris Connor. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to today's conversation and wrapping this whole thing up.
Yeah, me too. It's interesting the journey that we've come from, right? I mean, we kind of started off with the journey with a little bit of like why you might want it, and then a little bit more of the kind of building that initial part of your podcast, and then now we're finally at the final point of like, how do you get it out there? How do you really kind of pull the final pieces together? So I'm looking forward to this one as well. And yeah, I mean, it seems like it's been a good journey as well, and I feel like we've had more and more people join us at different times. So in the meantime, I've been on jury duty. You went on vacation, came back, and yeah, it's good to get together again.
Yeah, likewise. Here we are. I hope if people are, on the LinkedIn Live, they'll throw in some comments about whether they're actually thinking about if, this has caused them to take another step toward making a podcast, if they're looking for ideas or they've been wanting to do one and now they're waiting for this last piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and we can see comments, by the way. So as they come in, we will be able to see them as well. So feel free to throw a comment in there, and if we can answer it here, I'll put it up on the screen, and we'll get to it. So yeah, with that, just let me kind of bring us back to the slides that we put together for this. So as I mentioned, we've had three sessions. This is the third of the three, and so the first one was focused on why you would focus on having a B2B podcast, what's the advantage, and things like that. And Chris and I really dove deeply in terms of why you might think about pulling together a B2B podcast. Then the next part was on more of the content and the format of your show. Like, how would you format a show? Would it be a solo podcast, or would you have guests similar to what we're doing here? And yeah, how would the discussion flow? And then in this one, we're going to talk about more about technology and distribution.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about really the nuts and bolts. Like, what is the hardware and software you need? How do you record a podcast? How do you edit a podcast? And then, most importantly, as it is for any kind of content you're going to create, how do you distribute that so the most people can find you and connect to you, subscribe to your podcast, and so on? And then we'll wrap up with, in case all of this looks a little overwhelming, there are other ways to take advantages of podcasts um, without necessarily going through all the steps of recording and editing and so on.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up because I was also on a call earlier today, and somebody had said that as a part of the call. They said, "Man, it just seems like pulling all these pieces together is can seem really daunting as well." And I can understand that, right? I mean, I do think about the fact that you and I both have gone through somewhat of an evolution through time, right? And the technology has grown along with that. One of the things that I think we were trying to advocate most out of these sessions, though, as well, is taking that simple approach first, so that you're not trying to do everything to get started. And there's lots of ways to kind of edit the back end and things like that. So I think we'll cover a lot of those as we go through as well.
Yeah, keeping it simple is the way to get started. And honestly, uh, there's nothing in the simple approach that's going to diminish the quality of your podcast.
Yeah. So maybe we should just start with the kind of the hardware, microphones and headphones. You have over the ear headphones on, Chris, and do you want to talk about kind of what you recommend to get started?
Yeah, sure. So I've had these since the very start, I think, of my podcast, maybe the third or fourth episode in. And the purpose of the headphones is so you can hear your guests, of course, very well, but it also prevents the sound that's coming through your computer from going back into your guest computer and eliminates the echo. So some sort of headphones are always recommended. At this point, honestly, earpods can work. I think that over the ear headphones work a little better. In terms of microphones, I recommend that you get what's called a dynamic mic. And my favorite, which I don't have in front of me because I'm using something different, is the Audio Technica ATR 2100. And the reason I like it is it can be plugged into your laptop directly as a USB, but it also has a connection for what is called an XLR cable. It's one of those thicker cables that has a larger pin on it with 3 pins in it, and you can then connect it to other devices. So, for example, I have a mixing device on my desktop here that allows me to record a backup, for example, or I can take it with me to record people remotely. So, again, the ATR 2100 is what I like because it just offers you very flexible options and outstanding sound quality. If that's all you ever used, that would be great. And then I'll just throw in this. Um, if you want to go super simple, this I used to send this headset to all my guests. It's a Logitech H390.
Would you mind showing
Um,
that again? I know it was
yeah,
really small
yeah.
on the screen for everybody, so I came back to here. So there
Oh,
you go.
there we
Yeah.
go. So just a simple headset. As I said, I used to send it to every one of my guests. It's like $25. I found that after the pandemic, a lot of people had headsets. And during the pandemic, the price skyrocketed, but it came back down. Um, and the sound quality was excellent. Now, editing software has gotten so good that any reasonable mic can be made to sound really, really good with software. So, but you could use that yourself as both headphones and microphone, and no one would know the difference.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the Audio Technica microphones definitely, um, are nice because they, connecting in USB to your computer is a great way to sort of get started without a lot of equipment, right? I mean, you don't really need that much, but the better that your audio is without, producing an echo or having any sort of hiss or anything like that, those things, definitely, do help you as well longer term to hold on to your audience, especially whenever you get to the audio side of things. So the audio side of podcasting, obviously, having some form of of an audio podcast and having it broadcast out there is kind of the end goal of this. Um, and with that, you think about the fact that people are going to listen to 30 minutes or however long your episodes are, and if you have something that's producing a constant pop or echo or anything like that, it just really wears hard oftentimes on the audience, and you'll wind up losing people because of strange little technical glitches as well.
Yeah. I will say, if you're wondering why I use something different now, is because I've had to do some remote podcasts where I was interviewing some pretty high profile people in a noisy hotel atrium. And so I got the mic that I'm using here because it rejects a lot of sound from behind the microphone. It's very directional. So it doesn't eliminate it. You can tell we were in a noisy room, but you could hear the other speaker, both of us, very clearly. But that's sort of an exceptional situation. I do that maybe once a year where I actually need that.
Hmm. Yeah. That makes sense. Right now, I'll try and lift it up so that we can again see it in the image here. So I'm using this is a Rode USB mic. I'm currently traveling, so USB cable's plugged into the back. My headset's plugged in as well to the back, and it allows me both to hear what's going on as well as allows me to be able to just travel a little lighter than what I normally have. Similar to Chris, I have um, a mixing board that I wouldn't necessarily recommend for most people. I bought it because I felt like there were a lot of people recommending them at different times. And what I have really found over time is that oftentimes, and Chris and I were doing this earlier, we're having to troubleshoot the the hardware that we have and software that we have, and I was having to troubleshoot on my end because um, I've had issues with this particular mic and the software because it's not as easy and seamless as you might think, and so I do think for that reason the Audio Technica microphone's a great suggestion. I've not had the easiest time with this Rode microphone, and that's why I kind of held off on not mentioning it for a little bit. I have had though an easier time with my AirPods. So in the past, this is my AirPods have been just a great way to go. I don't turn anything else on. I just essentially turn on my laptop and pop in my AirPods, and they work fine. In terms of headphones, what I have in are ear monitors. So these go in your ear versus over your ear. But I do have headphones on as well, and similar sort of thing as Chris. I've had issues with echoes and other random things if you don't have if everybody doesn't have headphones on. I oftentimes, whenever I have guests, the guests will show up without headphones, and then they'll ask, is this okay? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. I mean, I normally have to make a judgment call as to whether or not if it'll be a distraction for everybody, listening to the room echo and things like that. If there is any sort of space where the sound from me can come out, reflect off the wall, and then come back at a different time where the software wouldn't cancel it out. So, and I have had guests where I've said, look, I know that this is going to be severe. So I would suggest maybe we try, headphones. And yeah, I mean it's a small portion of time, oftentimes, but it is quite the discussion. I feel like oftentimes, with guests about headphones.
Yeah, I always, of course, try to let my guests know in advance, right, that headphones are preferred. But you have to remember, as you're doing, that you are standing in for the entire audience. And so you're sort of defending their experience. If you have to tell a guest, like, you know what, we might reschedule this at another time.
Yeah, yeah. All right, and then recording software. You want to talk a little bit about what you use on your end?
Yeah, so this is interesting because something just I did not change yesterday, but something has changed. So I use a software. It's an online platform called Riverside.fm. It's sort of the industry standard for lots of podcasts that you listen to are recorded on this platform. What I like about it, it's like a Zoom call, except for the fact that, of course, it records the video and the audio, but it records you and I, or however many people are on the call, on separate tracks, which is helpful when it comes to editing, because if there's a noise in my track while you're speaking, I can just take it out, right? And so if that was all combined and there's any challenges on one side or the other, you can only make changes on the entire thing, which isn't really what you want to do. It's sort of a blunt instrument. Whereas if you have separate tracks, you can do a better job of cleaning up the audio. So that's a very simple software. It's paid. What I'm going to say is, before that, I've gone through a couple different softwares. The absolute free one that is very good is called Audacity. I started out with that. You can download that, and it's very easy to use. The next step up was called Squadcast.fm, and I used that for many years and was very happy with that until I found Riverside. Now, the interesting thing is that the software I use for editing, which we'll talk about next, is called Descript, and they just bought Squadcast, and now Squadcast is free within Descript. So, which is a great thing. So I wouldn't hesitate to use that as well. I haven't used it since they added video. I think they're probably very comparable to Riverside. So now it's nice to have one thing and everything in one place. And all that to say that All of these things are continually getting better and better and better, merging the recording to the editing and the outputs that you can get. For example, Riverside now with AI presents me with little clips of my podcast that I can share on social with subtitles or captions on them, and I can export directly without doing any editing. So uh, it just keeps getting better and better. I'll shut up.
No, no, that's. I mean, I agree. I'm amazed quite frequently at the things that we started out with that were actually quite challenging. I started my podcast originally and was using I forget to Audition, Adobe's Audition to do a lot of the editing, but I was just doing my podcast on a Zoom call. So I started out just on a basic Zoom call and would take the audio, I'd record it and then take the audio out of it using Audition. And then I also used Audacity for a little while as well. But when Descript came along and offered the ability to see like a transcript, you can also edit the filler words. I oftentimes use filler words, so I'm it has quite the job. But oftentimes it's interesting to see the counts of filler words in a podcast that you have as well with it. But the uh, it is interesting to see these platforms evolve, not just to do editing anymore, but they're also offering recording and other things. I would strongly advocate for two different paths in this session. Given the fact that we are trying to suggest a simple path forward. One is, start out if you have Zoom or you have a way to record a video call, start out with that. And there's no reason why you couldn't take that call then and turn it around, do some minor editing to it, and then turn it around as a podcast. The other suggestion would be, because of some of the features that Riverside offers now, that would be the tool to go with. But again, I would closely monitor all of these tools that are out there that were mentioned, right? So Riverside and Descript, I would closely continue to monitor them because of the just the technology evolution that's going on as well.
Yeah, make friends with other podcasters. I've discovered or shared all these tricks with all my other podcasting friends. David Schifrin turned me on to one of these. I can't even keep track of who recommended what to whom anymore, but they're constantly evolving. And going back to what you said about recording on Zoom, honestly, if you listen to our advice on the microphones and headphones and get good sound quality, early on, other than making an intro for my podcast, which is unnecessary or could be recorded right before you start interviewing your guest, for example, you could publish a podcast with zero editing at all. And most people wouldn't notice, right? Unless the filler words are so over the top that it becomes annoying, which is rarely the case. For the first several years, I've gone back and forth on the amount of editing I do. Um, and honestly, I don't think it makes a huge difference unless there's a problem that you find annoying. So you could record a conversation and publish it, and if you have good sound quality, you're going to be okay.
Yeah. And if you want to know the platform that we're using here and things like that, so the way that this particular session is coming out to everybody is essentially I'm using Ecamm on my computer. Chris dials in just like a guest would to a podcast. And then from there, we're using Restream going out. But again, if I had I have an annual subscription to these tools. If I had it to go, I'll do over again right now. I would probably go back to Riverside, and may or may not continue with Ecamm. In terms of the ability to have the overlays and other things. It just depends in terms of the overall capability that we continue to see come out from Riverside. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And just to be clear, when Don says I dialed in, I put a link in my browser and hit join. That's
thank you for
that's what
that.
dialing in was. It's
Yeah,
it's just like a Zoom call. They all look just a little different, but the experience is essentially the same.
yeah. How about editing? What do you do in terms of editing, Chris?
So now, as I mentioned, I use a platform called Descript for editing, which is also getting better and better all the time. When it started out, what you do is you upload your audio or your video files, because it does video editing as well, all together into Descript. It will take the two files. So, for example, Don and I would each have a track here, and it matches them up and creates one transcript for the whole thing. And if there's anything that Don says that I don't want everybody else to hear, I select the words as if it was a Word document and I hit delete. It's that simple. And if I wanted to rearrange the conversation, so for some of my clients, I create podcasts where I've interviewed several, a handful of subject matter experts with different points of view. And I don't want to, it's not a continuous interview. I can cut and paste the nuggets from each of those conversations and narrate in between them to create what I'd like to say sounds like an NPR radio story, a news story. And the sound goes with the words. And it's that simple. So, as does the video. And then you can export the video in different formats. It can be, side by side as you're looking at here, or I can take Don alone and put him in a vertical format and have subtitles below him. Really, it can pretty much fix all the sound problems I have to deal with. So I rarely have to use Audition anymore to be very specific about removing a particular sound from an audio file. With a single click, um, it takes out room echo. It makes the voices sound richer. It does all those things really well. And that's why I don't send out headphones anymore, because it's so good at it that it just isn't necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, I've found the same thing with Descript as well. It's just become my go-to tool for so many things. I still create vertical videos the old-fashioned way with Descript. So I'm not using automated clips and things like that at this point. But I find it's nice to have that ability to kind of use one tool and just say, hey, look, these are the things that I want to export as a part of the story that we're trying to tell. And so yeah, I find that Descript has been a game changer for me as well in terms of editing. I have tried some automated AI tools for creating clips. So if you could think of, you have a long form, you know, audio file or whatever video file, and so I've tried different automated tools, but I keep coming back overall back to Descript, kind of long term in terms of a go-to tool to help overall.
If you're just starting out, I promise you would love it. And um, I can't imagine it being any easier, because I used to have to like listen to the podcast as it played and find the things I wanted to take out, or recognize what a really deep breath sounds like or looks like in a waveform and reduce it. That doesn't happen anymore.
Right. All automated. The other thing I would mention as well, if you are doing, let's say, a community chat kind of podcast, so you have two people essentially sitting at a table having a discussion, but maybe they have background noise as well. Um, as Chris had said, Descript has great tools to be able to remove that background noise as well. And I've actually held interviews in a very noisy conference center, and then have told it to apply its studio sound capability, and am amazed at how good it is at sort of removing the noise, but keeping everybody sounding that's being interviewed at least natural. And so You have to adjust a couple things, but it is so easy to do. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And then how about hosting? You use um, Substack?
I do use Substack because, well, for a number of reasons. So let me just back up and say that here's what a podcast host is doing for you. It stores all your audio files, which are relatively large, but your website may not be set up to deliver those on demand, um, at the, you know, in in an experience that your listeners would appreciate. And it generates an RSS feed. So it stores your files, and then whenever you add files and show notes, that's what automatically shows up on someone's tablet or phone without you having to do anything. So the process is you set up your host, and then whenever you upload an audio file, the RSS feed is automatically updated. They give you a URL that is the RSS feed, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But it's how it gets distributed. So, having said that, probably too much, um, I use Substack because I wanted to have all my content in one place. It's separate from my website, which the jury is still out on, honestly. But it makes publishing really easy. So it's free, and you can monetize it. So if you're successful enough that people want to pay to read what you have to say, Substack offers something for that. And just the experience of I upload the audio, I write, my thoughts about the episode, and I hit publish, and we're done. So my email list is on there as well. So notification goes out to everyone on my email list, and podcast goes out to all those subscribers. And it's just simple in that way. But there are other hosts, many to choose from. They're all pretty easy. They all do a good job. Most of them will create a podcast website for you, and some of them will let you put your own domain name on it instead of being, life science marketing radio.podbean.com. It can just be podcast.lifesciencemarketingradio.com.
Yeah.
For,
Yeah, the one that I use is Libsyn. So I use Libsyn. They do offer some. I would say it's very affordable, right? I mean, I think for 60 minutes or whatever, 60 minutes a week or something like that, it's like $15. So $15 a month. So yeah, I mean, Libsyn is who I have. They do offer. It's a very basic website. So essentially, you place your album art up there, which is a little graphic that's 3,000 by 3,000 pixels that you have to have for essentially showing people what your podcast is. And then you get to pick some basic colors, I think, and then they have like a very basic player that's a part of that. But the key thing with these hosts is having that ability to broadcast out, and that's where the RSS feed becomes really important, because if you wanted to go to Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all those things, that's done via RSS, and essentially they just continually listen for a signal to come from your channel, more or less, and then whenever you broadcast something out, it picks it up and says, "Oh, there's a new episode by Don or Chris," and here it is. And then people get it on their telephone and other things from there. Um, so Libsyn is a very good service. I've been very happy with them. The one that I would almost recommend, though, higher than going with Libsyn, would be to pick Buzzsprout. So, and the reason why is because I feel like as a new podcaster, they have some of the greatest tutorials online for any problem that you might run into. They probably have either a video or an article that deals with whatever it is. They have a great education capability, and they also have really interesting websites. I mean, their websites are more adjustable and things like that as well. And yeah, I mean, I think at least in terms of you know paid services, those would be the two that are top of mind for me would be either go with Libsyn or go with uh, Buzzsprout. The reason why I originally decided to go with Libsyn was because I was looking for that website capability and I couldn't easily find it at that point in time, and it seemed like Libsyn had it. And then once I'd fully signed up and got in there and tried adjusting everything, they didn't have what I was looking for anyway. So I wound up having to build something on my own for a while, and then slowly but surely I've got a different service that I use. But I mean, if I had it again to do all over again, I would keep it simple and just use what's incorporated inside of one of these services.
Yeah, the other one I'll throw out is Podbean that I've used, and I've used all of those: Podbean, Libsyn, Substack, and Squarespace. Actually, um, the cost of podcast hosting is probably the smallest part of the whole thing, and none of it's expensive. But the $15 a month, sometimes $100 a year, will get you more than you need. You want to consider analytics. The other thing you might want to consider when choosing your host, and I don't know if Libsyn does this, but I know Podbean does, is that you can create a private internal podcast. In other words, if you wanted to have a podcast only for your employees and possibly with multiple channels for different parts of your company, you can do that through Podbean. And so they have a way to, put a podcast app on the recipient's phone with a authenticated sign in so that only your employees can access it. The nice thing about that is for podcasting in general, you will know how many people downloaded your episodes, but you'll never know exactly who or for how long they listened. Whereas if you have an internal podcast, you can find out who's paying attention, if that's super important, or what kind of content your employees are actually engaging with, and create more of that. So that's something to consider, because I think internal employee podcasts are an overlooked opportunity for larger companies or even smaller ones.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, definitely. So I don't know whether or not if Libsyn offers the ability to have an internal private um, podcast. I've never had the challenge of trying to go figure that one out. So, but they do, um, also offer the ability as well to connect to a lot of different services if you're trying to broadcast it out and have a public podcast. So um, many of these things are equal across a lot of the platforms. As you start to look at them, you start to notice that there are little differences in terms of the channels that you can broadcast your podcast out to without having to manually go connect each thing to your RSS feed. So they sort of make that simple on the Libsyn side. The same with Buzzsprout, and I would imagine other services as well.
Yeah.
All right, and then in terms of distribution, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So podcast feed, we were just speaking about with the host. So what happens is once you've set up your host, they provide you with a URL that is an RSS feed, and that is the URL that you will then supply to Apple, Spotify, and Google. And I just got an email the other day from Amazon asking me to put my podcast up there as well, so that if you've got that, you're reasonably well covered. All the podcast apps essentially pull from one of those places, probably Apple and Google. Like they go in and they find, your content or all the content that's there. And then if people are looking for your podcast on their app, they know where to go get it. That's essentially it. So that's how the basics of distribution work. The advantage of Amazon, I'm not one of these people that listens on my device that shall not be named because there's one sitting next to me. But you could say, hey, what's your name? Play the latest episode of the Life Science Success podcast, and it would pop up.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I oftentimes, so I listen. I think we talked about this in one of the episodes as well. I oftentimes listen um, on my device more inside of the app that came with the device itself. And so whenever you're with Apple or Google, most likely, that's probably the place that most people are going to listen to a podcast from. Um, I'm not familiar with a lot of people that listen to Spotify podcasts, but again, I have, it seems like a good concentration of people that are there that consistently listen to Life Science Success, which is always surprising to me. But it's important from that standpoint that, again, you're trying to meet the audience with where they are, right? So finding that mix of like being on the right platform where people are looking. I originally, this is years ago, I signed up for the Amazon podcast capability. And I remember thinking to myself, who listens to Amazon podcasts? But again, if you have one of their little devices sitting on a table, it's much easier whenever you can voice command that you want to listen to it, and you're trying to figure out, like, I mean, if maybe it's somebody's cooking in their kitchen and they want to listen to a cooking podcast, or for B2B podcasts, maybe somebody has a device in their office and they're listening there. So it's more or less trying to figure out ways to socially engineer and make it easy for your audience to find your podcast whenever they want to do that.
Right. There's so little effort to getting it to those four places. You should think about, the kind of content you're creating and who might listen. So if I was a company that was producing a podcast, maybe a 5-minute news podcast every morning, like I look at yesterday's headlines and I say, here's what you might have missed or you might want to go dig into, that might be the thing that is listened to on an Amazon device while someone's having their coffee in the morning, right? But not necessarily the thing they would dial up in their car for a 30-minute ride. I don't know. But um, it's you just want to be covered.
Yeah. And then in terms of websites, so we talked about a website, right? I mean, oftentimes, so websites serve two purposes in my mind. They serve the purpose of, if somebody in the audience wants to go and learn about the guest, have show notes and things like that, the audience could go there. But oftentimes, and I would imagine the same with you now as well, Chris, is that I have organizations reaching out saying, hey, you should interview this individual from our organization, or maybe even it's an external PR firm working with that individual to try and help get them on as a guest. So I'll oftentimes get requests that way as well. And so it's a quite interesting thing that if the website weren't there, they would have to try and track me down, right? And there are ways to do that, because typically as a podcaster, you're having to mention who is publishing each one of the episodes. So in some way, people would be able to find you that way, but it would probably be a lot more laborious to try and do versus having a website where your podcast is.
Right. And then in terms of if you're starting a B2B podcast and you already have a corporate website, so maybe you have a blog, maybe you have some other resources, any one of these hosts will provide you with a block of code to put the player that they're using or that they present on this hosted website onto your own website. So essentially, it's another place to find you visually on the web with a player. Press the triangle, start listening.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a whole decision that has to be made as well in terms of do you want the SEO for the podcast to come into your corporate website or not? Is there a benefit to having it separate? Um, for me, it was a lot harder to manage a website that had everything incorporated in it. That was my feeling, was that I was having to jump through a lot more hoops versus having a website that was really specifically made for podcasts. So um, for that reason, I separated it out. But there have been times where I've kind of come back to that thought, just thinking, man, all that SEO, all of the search engine optimization words that would have come from the podcast would have been built into my website had I just kept all of that content together, and it would have been more beneficial for my consulting website from that standpoint. I also think it's a little more confusing because whenever you would put in the URL or the address to go to the website, it would do a little translation and then flip over to my consulting website. So it wouldn't stay permanently as that
Mm,
URL. And I just always would think, where people think that there was some sort of bait and switch going on, that I was, essentially, trying to lead them to somewhere else. But I never had any complaints, but it was one of those things that always ran into my mind as well, in terms of, the perception that people would get through putting the URL in.
right. I'll say one of the things I think the SEO consideration is an important one. And when I started out, one, I named my podcast what I named it um, before it was my business name uh, for search reasons. And with every episode, I used to put up a PDF of the transcript. You could also publish the entire transcript on your page to get the full SEO benefit of all those conversations, which would be over time probably enormous. I will say that I think after a period of time, I realized that my podcast was becoming reasonably well known. And I said, I can do without that. And I'm not comfortable putting up an automated podcast or automated transcript now
Right.
because I don't think the quality is high enough. It's not a good user experience. And honestly, it can be confusing if you don't know what the conversation was about. They're very good, but it would be a stumble to read through. But I did have one person in particular who's been a guest a couple times say, I always download your transcripts and I read them on the plane and I make notes on them.
Huh.
So, but unfortunately, I've stopped, making those PDF transcripts because I had to pay for a human transcript, and I decided that wasn't. I didn't see the actual ROI beyond that one person who really loved them. So,
Right. And the cost, it's pretty cost prohibitive, from what I've seen as well. The cost for a 30-minute episode was about
might be
what?
$50.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
and so
Yeah.
which I didn't mind paying $25 an episode to send out a headset for good sound quality. That was part of my marketing budget, but I didn't feel like the $50 an episode for a transcript was getting me anything.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so the next one up is social media. Um, you know, certainly there's a lot of ways to broadcast both episodes as well as clips, and that's one of the reasons why we talked about clips a little bit ago, on different social media platforms. So you think about Instagram Reels now has the ability to have short little clips. You can also have YouTube Shorts, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, like I said. So, I mean, there are lots of different places where you can leverage the clips in social media. And then there are platforms like LinkedIn where we're broadcasting now, and YouTube where you can live broadcast things as well, depending on the platform that you're on. I believe that Riverside allows that ability as well. Does it not, Chris?
Correct. So if
Yeah.
you were using Riverside to record your podcast, you could live stream to Facebook and YouTube and so on
Yeah.
directly from there. I've done that one time, I think, just because I'm not typically a live streamer. I can't even remember what it was, but it can be done.
Yeah. All right. And then YouTube, I am seeing a lot of great benefits from shorts. So the more shorts that I put out, I notice that it drives a lot more traffic, increases a lot more subscribers as well. And so, again, I've seen, great benefits in that, and in just having that ability. And then, Chris, you're like the master, I feel like, at repurposing. Do you want to cover this one?
Well, I'm going to stay on YouTube for a second. I mean, and I think this is probably true for all the short form videos, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. Um, the algorithms are so good at figuring out what you're liking that when I have tested YouTube Shorts by putting clips up, they get a good amount of traffic with zero effort whatsoever in terms the traffic that your full length videos would never get. But if you can get people to pay attention to those shorts and then direct them for the few people that will look in the description to your full length podcast, hopefully, as you say, drive subscribers. And this is really what we're talking about on social media and YouTube in general. Your podcast, I like to say, is not the end product, it's the raw material for creating all these video snippets, clips that you can spread all over social media and your web channels and third party channels, perhaps. Um, and then write articles based on those transcripts. Those can be repurposed into blog posts. You can send them out in newsletters and put those articles, on some third party sites as sponsored content, for example. So if you're just recording a podcast, that's great. And there are people who love podcasts, but discovery is a challenge. And really, that's sort of what we're talking about in this entire slide here, is that people don't necessarily know what they're looking for. So it's helpful to put your content in multiple places to be found. And then, of course, you can get a lot out of it. Some people don't want to listen to a podcast, but they will happily read the article.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you said, it's some people um, may not always listen to the audio as well, and so this idea of having an article or a blog post that sort of ties what you covered in the interview, or at least who the guest was, could be very interesting to people as well. And so you kind of think of, one, your B2B podcast could be a place for you to tie to people, but then you also want this kind of larger audience to be interested in listening to it, right? And through that, you should consider things like written articles and blog posts, and ways to mention your podcast and kind of the topics that you're covering in newsletters and things like that.
Right. And I'll just throw out one of my goals that I try to do. So sometimes when I write the show notes for my podcast, I'm describing what the conversation was about. Of course, I always say what it was about, and I may highlight or bullet point some of the things that we talked about to get people to go listen to it. At the same time, or sometimes separately, I'm trying to write my thoughts about what we talked about. So, in other words, to not rehash the episode, but say, we talked about this and it got me thinking about that.
Mm.
That's a goal I'm working. Honestly, I'm working with a writing coach. I'll throw it out, Brian Morgan. I'm getting help because that's what I want to add something different. I want people to listen to the podcast, but I also want them to know I have something to say about it.
Very good. And then you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, this is an easy one. Read the bullet. If I'll be a wise guy. If all of this looks like it's too much work, I mean, you can keep it simple. I highly recommend keeping it simple and trying it. There's no penalty for trying and failing. You could record podcasts and not publish them and see, is this a sustainable thing? Without even investigating a host and spending money that way. However, there are people who, and some of them will be appearing on my podcast soon, who establish their own thought leadership by getting on multiple other podcasts. And it's a way to reach an even broader audience. So, as a thought leader in your industry, you might decide, I don't need to be on my own corporate podcast every week. I'll be on someone else's podcast and create a library of material around that. So that's the other strategy that I've seen seems to work for some people. And there are PR agencies who do nothing but get people on podcasts.
Right. And luckily they bring guests to shows like yours and mine. So I'm certainly
Yeah.
always thankful for the engagement as well. The other thing I would mention though too is, and we covered this previously, but um, when you're a guest, the key thing that you want to walk away with is not just being a guest on the podcast. It's a moment in time. It will fleet very quickly, and then all of a sudden, the goodwill that you built up for you or your business will also go away just as quickly, because the audience is moving on to the next episode and the next episode, or even other podcasts. So if you think about the streams that we oftentimes see either on Twitter or LinkedIn, right? I mean, there's just a constant stream of things that are coming out, and the only way to sort of re broadcast or re-release that goodwill is to have, again, clips of the podcast that you just did. And so I've seen a lot of people do this really well. There's one particular individual that was on my podcast 4 months ago, and just this last week they were still releasing again, snippets of the things that were discussed, and where people could find the full episode, which is amazing. Oftentimes, many organizations don't do that, and I feel like it's a true missed opportunity, because um, the way social media works today is that I may or may not spot what you did on the interview today, and if not, then essentially I'll kind of not even know that happened. So
Yeah, I mean, it's also a way to build a reputation as being a good guest. And then, if you help out people by sharing your content and help the host get found, then they're going to, share it more and help you get found as well. That's how social media works.
right. Yeah, and so if anybody does want to get started, so Chris covered, if this seems overwhelming, obviously you could always be a guest, but if you do want to get started, I created this B2B podcasting jumpstart checklist, and so if you go to bit.ly B2B jumpstart forward slash B2B jumpstart, you will just be brought to the guide. You don't have to register or anything like that. It's free and available for anybody that wants to go download it. So feel free to go grab a copy of that B2B podcast jumpstart. And essentially, it's a checklist that walks you from the very beginning all the way through to a podcast being up and running, and provides suggestions for equipment and software and things like that along the way. And I think that what I would sort of come back to is I would use the suggestions that we went to here first, and if you want to try any of the things that are suggested in the checklist, then feel free.
Nice. Highly recommended.
All right. So, Chris, do you want to talk about how you can help?
Sure. Thank you. So, the way I help companies with content generally is based on podcasting, but I create written, video, and audio content. So, a couple of the ways I work with clients are to just get them set up, like we've just been talking about for the last 3 sessions. Like, what should we talk about? How do we do it? And I have a package for that. And then for some podcasts, I have been hired simply as a host in the life science space, something I know something about, simply to interview people where the client then does their own production or they have access to production resources. For other clients, I host and produce their podcasts. So pretty much any level that you want help with in your podcast, I am happy to help you with, as well as creating the snippets on the back end, getting it to third-party sites, and distributing it on social media.
Yeah. And so from my side, I've been working on a B2B podcast class, and I'm looking for individuals that would be interested in being in the beta group for that B2B podcast class. So if you are interested, I would say probably the best way to let me know would be to send me a direct message in LinkedIn and let me know that you'd be interested in being a part of that overall session. And I can let you know whenever it's at a stage that I'm ready to release the first portion of the class. But the whole idea is to hopefully have a training class to make some of this simple. If you're a do-it-yourself kind of person and you want to go do it yourself, then this would be a great way to get educated on doing that. And then yeah, if you're somebody that has a busy business life, you're not necessarily wanting to go do it yourself, then I would say go visit Chris.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, lots of ways to do it. I mean, it's not difficult, but it takes time like everything else, and a lot of people are busy. So just handing it off to someone who can do that is the thing.
Yeah, I did want to open it up for any quick questions that anybody has. I know that we're coming up close on the hour, but I did want to, just try and open it up again. If you submit a comment inside of LinkedIn or YouTube where this is going out, we would see those comments come back, as well. And but yeah, I mean, in the meantime, the I feel like there's just this whole evolution happening as well, Chris, with podcasting and social media and everything. There's just this real acceleration of technology that's happening, and I mean, it's just amazing to watch. How many problems that I feel like we've had earlier on with having to manually edit a lot of these files and things. I remember there used to be certain sounds in my podcast I'd have to try and buy like special add-ins for to try and remove them and other
Right.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's getting easier and easier all the time to make a podcast, and podcast listening is still growing. More and more people are listening to podcasts. I'm sure people, for those who are still commuting, in my opinion, broadcast radio doesn't have much interesting to offer. um, yeah, I'm just a geezer in that sense. So, but I'd happily listen to, that's when I listen to podcasts is when I'm driving.
Yeah, I'm always amazed though too. The number of commercials that commercial radio can pack in, um, as well without any real substantive either content or discussion. Right? I mean, I feel like there are places where you can go to like listen to really engaging conversations, but I also sort of hear intermingled in that a lot of commercials and things like that, and typically on podcasts, if you're going to receive an advertisement, it's probably going to be most likely at the beginning or the middle. And most podcast apps allow you to fast forward past a lot of that stuff as well. If you know that happens every single time, and it's the first 6 minutes of every show, then you can tell your podcast app, hey, look, skip the first 6 minutes. So
Yeah, I would just you triggered me that an app or an ad came up in the middle of a podcast that I wasn't expecting the other day, because usually they are always at the beginning, and then there was one in the middle, and it was kind of not really well connected to the content, which was surprising for this person's podcast that I have listened to for a long time. Um, but yeah, I just think when you get to choose who you're going to listen to, um, I
right,
think there's benefit.
absolutely. Well, Chris, I mean, I really appreciated this time, and I appreciated the the fact that we got to do these 3 sessions together. I feel like that building this, hopefully will benefit some folks, and yeah, I mean, also will help to connect us to even more people that are wanting to do this. So, thank you.
Likewise. Well, it was your idea. Thank you for making it happen and driving it forward. It's been fun talking to you about all these things as always. And yeah, hopefully we can help some folks out.
All right, thanks a lot. All right, let me click the button.